All right, guys, I'm back. I'm back from sort of a 1 week suspension on YouTube. When I say it's a suspension, well, for 1 week, I wasn't able to post anything. I wasn't able to upload anything on YouTube. And recall that I was having a live stream about a week ago. I was covering the conversation between the liberal kid and 20 conservatives on Jubilee's channel. And then the stream just got pulled off in the middle of the stream. And recall that something like that had happened about a few days earlier when I was covering um, the debate between Charlie Kirk and the 25 liberal kids. So it turns out that it's against YouTube's community guidelines for you to stream, do run commentary on on something like Jubilee's channel directly from his channel. I don't know, but somehow they gave me community strike for that, and that was why I've not been able to post anything for about a week. And if something like that happens again, I may not be able. Probably might get my channel terminated. I've been having these issues over and over again. I don't know what I've done to YouTube. I've been demonetized for months, and just getting strikes and left, right, and center. Anyway, so today I'm going to be having a conversation on. I want to cover. Hopefully, I don't get a strike this time again. I want to cover the conversation between Ryan Grimes and Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh went on Broken Points to, promote his new documentary. Am I a racist? Recall that he had done What is a Woman? What is a Woman is something that really did well. A lot of people liked it. I liked it at the time it came out, right? I think I still do like it, right? And Matt Walsh used to be my favorite of the Daily Wire crew. I thought he had this deadpan trolling, attitude. I thought he had this sort of humor, this dry humor. But it turns out this guy is a fucking lunatic because he actually believes some of those things he says. So when he says he's a theocratic fascist, it literally means he's a theocratic fascist. Now, I used to think that he was joking in some of those things that he was saying. But no, he's not joking. He actually means those things. Hi, Stanley, how you doing? So I'm going to share I'm going to just, as I normally do, I'll share the content and then just react to it as we go. So let's go.
We are joined now by Matt Walsh, who is out with a new movie called Am I Racist? That is in theaters around the country. Matt obviously hosts his eponymous show with the Daily Wire. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah. Now, the movie's doing pretty well. I don't know if it was a coincidence or fate, whatever it was, as it happened, when your movie was released last week, everyone was debating whether a very particular post on social media was racist. So we thought we would play a little game of Was It Racist? With Laura Loomer's infamous curry tweet. If Kamala Harris wins, the White House will smell like curry and White House speeches will be facilitated via a call center. And the American people will only be able to convey their feedback through a customer satisfaction survey at the end of the call that nobody will understand. One of the interesting things about your movie, which I really enjoyed, Ryan might have something to add on that, we might disagree on it, I really enjoyed it, is getting to the bottom of the the industrial complex that's been built up around race relations that often will advance this silly, incoherent, elite definition that used to be prolific in academia and then leaked out into the rest of the world. So by the sort of definition of racism that you're challenging in this film, is that Laura Loomer tweet racist? And then by the kind of definition that you're trying to promote of racism, which maybe you have a way to explain it, I would define, I don't want to put words in your mouth, as just sort of like genuine discrimination based on this belief that people of a different race are somehow inferior.
Yeah.
Is this post-racist?
Okay, so something I noticed about this current election cycle is that the race talk is totally flipped, right? It used to be the Democrats who were hung up on race. They were the ones who were always talking about race, talking about gender, talking about all those diversity stuff. And something that Kamala Harris has done beautifully well is that she has been so mute on the issue of race. She hasn't said anything about race. In fact, she laughed at the question when it was brought up about her race. She just scoffed like, next question, because it wasn't really relevant, right? And she's not playing the race card, she's not playing the woman card, and this is just driving Republicans nuts. I mean, they don't know how to handle it, they don't know how to deal with this, so they have to bait her. They have to bait her with race talk, like what Laura Luma did with this tweet, right? She's trying to bring something. Oh, she's Indian. Oh, and this is something about Indian people. They're fraudsters with call centers, or they're going to smell like curry and all those other nonsense, right? So they're asking Matt Walsh, is this a racist tweet? Because some people are saying this tweet is racist. Is this a racist tweet? Now, before I give my give my thoughts on whether I think this is a racist tweet, I just like to hear what Matt Walsh has to say about this.
I mean, by the definition advanced by the DEI industry, it certainly would count as racist.
Right.
I wouldn't call it racist. I think it's just kind of a dumb joke. Not very helpful joke. And also, by the way, I like Indian food. So I think when things smell like curry, I'm a huge fan of curry personally. So I don't see that as an insult. But look, someone engaging in stereotypes, it might be insensitive, it might be unhelpful politically, but it's not necessarily racist. In fact, I would say it's often not racist because to me, what racism means is that you hate people of another race and or you think they're inferior to you in some way inherently because of their immutable characteristics. So that's racism. And as long as you don't feel that way about another race of people, then you're not racist. You might have stereotypical views about another group.
Yeah, but you see, that's just one definition of racism, right? Isn't just about you hating people, or it isn't just about you thinking that you are superior to another person. That's what makes racism. There is another much more substantive definition of racism, which is what you see that's much more pervasive, which is prejudice or discrimination against a person based on their being a member of a certain group, based on their race. And we can see from this tweet, it is very clear that Laura Luma was saying this thing. She's obviously, like Matt Walsh has admitted, that she meant it in a negative way. She was obviously prejudiced against Kamala Harris. Why was it necessary for her to invoke curry? Oh, because she's of Indian heritage. So what's the relevance to that? Why is it necessary for her to invoke the stereotype that Indians are fraudsters? They engage in call center scams and all that. Why is that relevant again? How does that relate to Kamala Harris other than the fact that she has Indian heritage? So she was prejudiced against Kamala Harris. She was discriminatory against Kamala Harris. Discriminatory, no, but that was clear prejudice. And it was solely based on the fact that Kamala Harris had Indian heritage. So by that definition, yeah, you could say this is racist. But Matt Walsh is saying that this strict definition of racism, if you don't hate someone, if you don't think you are superior to someone, then you cannot be racist against them despite anything you say. And I've got to ask, how exactly do you know if someone thinks someone else is inferior? How exactly do you know if someone hates someone else? Racism is more of an act, I would say, than it is merely a thought process. It's something that is self-evident when it is expressed, and people are able to see that this is racist, right? So, what Matt Walsh would want to restrict the definition of racism to this very strict mode where you have to start thinking about what this person means or what this person is actually feeling, whether this person thinks they are superior or inferior to another person, to be able to judge whether that is racist. By that metrics, nobody would be racist because most people would not admit that they think that they are superior to another person or someone of another race. Most people are not going to admit that that's whatever definition Matt is giving. They are not going to admit that.
For people, everybody does, but it's not automatically racist if you don't also harbor that ill will towards them. And as far as whether or not, so the real answer is that with the Laura Loomer tweet, I wouldn't say that it's racist. The only person who can answer whether it's racist is her. We'd have to ask her, well, do you hate people of Indian descent? Do you think that they're...
And this is the point I was just making. How exactly are you going to determine that she's racist? If she is the only one that can tell you whether or not she's racist, do you think she's going to admit that she's racist? Do you think that she's going to say, oh, I said this thing out of, hatred for Indians, or I said this thing out of a feeling of superiority over Indians? She's never going to admit that. But you can clearly see that she was prejudiced against Kamala Harris based on her lineage or her heritage.
Inferior to you in some way? If the answer is yes, then yeah, that's racist. But she'd probably say no. And if she said no, then I'll have to take her word for it. She's the only one who can speak to her own, what's going on in her own mind and her own heart.
So people are just going to say racist things. They're just going to do racist stuff. And the way to determine whether or not it's racist, to simply ask them, are you being racist? And they say, oh, well, no. Then you just let them go. Yeah, sure. Be the judge and jury in your own case.
Although she's a Trump supporter, she wants Kamala to lose. Presumably she's making the point in a negative way,
Well,
right?
it's also-
Like this is a bad thing.
That's
like
kind of-
call center and like she's saying these are all bad things.
Well,
Yeah,
this is
so
an-
she's implying that there's something bad about Indians, right? She's implying that there's something about Indians that makes them unfit for office, and that the fact that Kamala Harris has Indian heritage, she shouldn't be fit for office. I mean, how does the White House smelling like curry, how does that even relate to anything that has to do with politics? Why is that even relevant in the conversation at all?
Interesting point about
So that
stereotyping.
would, by your definition, make it.
Because stereotyping is often leveraged to say that there's something negative that is
Yeah.
generally attributed to someone of a different race.
Right. It's correct. It's negative. She means it in a negative way. Because we can assume that she thinks things smelling like curry is a bad thing. I guess not a fan of Indian food. But you can believe or engage in or repeat negative stereotypes and not be racist. You might just happen to think. So, for example, I'll give another example. Somebody might say, Asians are bad drivers. I don't know if that's actually true statistically. I'm not sure. But if you happen to believe that it's true, does that mean that you hate Asians? No, it just means that you think that Asians, by and large, are bad drivers. No.
So he's reducing, like I said earlier, he's reducing racism to simply hate. It's not hate, it's prejudice. And besides, whatever happened to treating people as individuals? I mean, this is a very big conservative right-wing talking point, that you need to treat people as individuals. The individual is supreme, but somehow you can just look at a group of people and assign attributes to them. Whether or not that is true for majority of the group of people, why do you have to assign such attributes to them if the individual is supreme? This is collectivism. This is assigning group characteristics. These are assigning certain characteristics to a person because they're a member of a certain group. But if you wanted to go by the conservative principle of the individual is supreme, then you're going to have to judge Kamala Harris on her merits. You're going to judge her on herself. You're going to look, have you gone to her house and everyone was smelling of curry? Have you gone to her house and see that she's operating a call center from her house, that she's defrauding people? Have you done any of that? That would be the individualistic thing to do. But you're doing the collectivist thing, and he's just waving it off and say, "Oh yeah, it's fine, it's okay." But mouthwash is going to get mad if people say, "Oh, white people are racist." Just because some white people are racist does not mean white people are racist. By his logic, we should be able to say that. That you should be able to make that collective, attribute and say white people are racist. But he's going to kick against that. But he is going to admit that there are individual racist white people. So in my mind, it seems as if white people get to be individuals, but every other person gets to be a group. Every other person gets to be an avatar for their race or whatever.
Doesn't mean you hate them. It doesn't mean that you're racist against them.
Although it could mean that you think there's like an intellectual inferiority, or it could mean you think there's a cultural reason that they're bad at driving in Western countries.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, and no one thinks that Asians are intellectually inferior. I think
Right.
everybody understands that that's one of the other, because stereotypes can be positive too. Another stereotype is that they're very good at math and science and that sort of thing. So, there are generalizations you can make about groups of people that can be largely true. And I'm not sure I've ever heard a stereotype where I thought to myself, well, that bears no resemblance to reality. I don't know, unless one of you could think. I've never heard a stereotype where I said,
yeah, but you just admitted that the stereotype of Asians being bad drivers, you don't know if that's true. So this is totally contradicting the point that you made earlier. You said you've never heard of a stereotype and that you don't think correlates with reality. But in a few seconds ago, you said that the stereotype that Asians are bad drivers, you don't know if that is true. So what am I going to take? Which is true from the statement you're making now?
I don't even know where that comes from. That's just falling out of the sky. Usually stereotypes arise because, society has observed things about groups of people. and they can be negative, they can be positive, but I don't see them as inherently racist.
Now, we have a clip from the film that we want to roll here. Let's go ahead and play this. This is from the dinner scene. Matt, you've probably seen this 100 times by now, but
A few times.
let's take a watch.
I used to be a white woman, an unsuccessful one, for many decades, and it was a miserable experience. And really, the hatred of yourselves and each other is like the not seeing your power, the being afraid. Like all you do is talk shit about each other, talk shit about yourself. Oh my God, I'm so fat.
That's all they do. I'm telling you, these white women.
But that's it. It's I'm so fat, I'm so stupid, I'm blah blah blah.
Sorry.
Your kids are watching you, and they're watching you talking shit about each other, raging against the machine or being silent or whatever the hell it is that you're doing or not doing. And they know that you're not doing shit for them.
That's so important. That is so important what you just said. It's really important. That's all.
We may have to add you to our team.
Oh, I would love to take a seat and join you.
No, you're not allowed to.
How'd you get the cameras in there, by the way? Like, set that up for us?
Yeah, they're not hidden cameras.
Obviously, they're like cinematic level.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody knew they were being.
Everybody's mic'd up, and
everybody's mic'd. Everybody knew they were being filmed, and they thought they were being filmed for a documentary about anti-racism, which they were, because that is what we made.
True.
So we, that's what we told people. We're making a documentary on anti-racism.
And did they know you were involved in it?
Probably not. Probably not.
So they're this waiter, like they didn't know that the waiter was part of the film.
No, they didn't.
But they knew you had to be mic'd up because everybody in the kitchen and everywhere else had signed the thing. Is that how that worked? Or?
I don't think they knew that I had a mic on. And we tried
listening. All right.
explaining to the women, and they seem to really enjoy it.
It's weird to me because they famously, I guess it's not so famous, but they back in, this was years ago. I think this was pre-COVID. There was a podcast called Femsplainers that Danielle from.
So I kind of assumed that they do the same.
You're familiar with Ryan Grimm, noted liberal journalist Ryan Grimm.
So he's right about 12% of the time, which I appreciate.
I'll take that.
So, but they're kind of in this interesting bubble that they not only didn't know who I was, but also I think it was kind of inconceivable to them that they would ever find themselves in a room with someone who doesn't agree with them. I think it just never occurred to them because it's never happened before. Robin DiAngelo appears later in the film, and I think me sitting in the room with her was probably the first time in like 20 years that she's actually sat across the room from someone who doesn't already agree with everything that she.
Yeah, but the thing is that even conservatives live in a bubble as well. They might think that they interact with other people, but they interact insofar as to try to knock down other positions or other opinions. It's not because they're trying to learn other perspectives. It's not because they're trying to understand where another person is coming from. Right-wing bubble is the biggest bubble you can ever think about, because you would be fed with so much information confirming your bias. I've been there, I've done that, I know that, right? Until I started, deliberately diversifying my source of information, I thought all the left-wing people were crazy. I really thought, I thought they were crazy. But when I started diversifying my sources of information, I was like, okay, yeah, I don't agree with you on this here and there, but in this area, it seemed reasonable, right? So as much as Mouthwash wants to make it seem as if it's only left-wing people who live in a bubble, that also exists in the right.
Thanks.
Part of the 12% that I've been right about over the years, I think, has been that I do think this entire DEI industry is, a grift, and it's just milking corporations, and also that
you've written about that.
Yeah, and that it is actively harmful in the sense that when corporations, I actually do believe that corporations oftentimes internally do have racist structures set up within them, and also they all operate sometimes in racist ways. And when they get sued for that, and they're facing the consequences of that, one of the things that they do is they hire these DEI consultants.
Right.
And say, well, you can't come after us, actually. How could we possibly be racist?
And I think this is a very important point that Ryan is just making, that at times some of these DEI initiatives or the DEI departments themselves, they are like a band-aid, right? They are there to say they are fighting racism. They are there to say they are making everything much more equal and egalitarian, but actually they are trying to mask a deeper problem, right? There's systemic issues, right? But they are there to be the face of, oh, we can't be racist because we have DEI, we're implementing DEI policies. Well, you can have people of color, you can have black people, you can have working in an environment, but still treat them like shit, or still they can still be discriminatory practices happening there. You can have women working in an organization and still get to face misogyny. So for the fact that you have women there, you have a diverse workforce, doesn't mean that you're not misogynistic, doesn't mean you're not racist. So I agree totally with Ryan that these DI initiatives at times, not all the time, at times, they're just a band-aid to cover up a deeper problem.
Like, we spent this money to bring these consultants in, and the consultants then cover for their more systemic racism to be allowed to continue without being interrogated. What it does is it turns the interrogation inward, where you say, well, these structures and these corporations can't be challenged. What we really need to do is look inside and find our own racism. And because we're all born with it or whatever.
Yeah. So what that does is it absolves the culture, it absolves the organization of taking any responsibility for making sure that there is an enabling environment for people to work or thrive, right? And it tries to push it to the individual and say, oh, this is an individual thing. It's not something about the culture. But you forget that it is people's attitudes that make a culture. It is people themselves that make something, that make an institution, right? So if there are certain practices that is allowed within the culture itself, even if the individual is not, this is not something that the individual is doing, then it's going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact in whether the place is a racist place, systemically racist. I know people have, that word triggers a lot of people. It will trigger Matt Walsh right now. And the word used to trigger me. Yeah, used to trigger me. Like, I would make the argument that Matt Walsh makes, or that because there are no racist laws, then it therefore means that systemic racism doesn't exist. But that was naive of me, because oftentimes these things which are systemic, they exist irrespective of the laws. That, in fact, they often exist in opposition to laws, right? That's why they're systemic. They are actually in contravention of existing laws. So take corruption, for example. There are no laws supporting corruption, but if you have an institution that is corrupt, it is because people there have decided to ignore the law. They decided to do whatever they want to do. In places where corruption is systemic, it's not because the laws allow corruption to occur. It is because people there have taken it as a part of their culture to ignore the law, to ignore what they should be doing right. So the argument that systemic racism cannot exist because there are no laws against it, it just goes out the window.
It's just inculcated in us. None of us are then responsible for it, and so therefore we're not responsible for actually changing anything on a system-wide basis. But I'm curious, as somebody who like spent so much time within this grift of a system, like, what was your take on these folks? Like, do they believe what they're saying, or have they found like a consultancy that is
D'Angelo's good,
that they're able to make money on, and they're kind of now locked into it?
Yeah, it's well, the short answer is I don't know exactly if they believe what they say, but it strikes me that they probably don't believe much of it, especially the parts of it that are so absurd on their face. But there's a lot of money in it, as we discovered making the film, and then of course there's a lot of power and influence.
I mean, isn't that the bane of capitalism? Money, 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 money. If profit is the goal of anything, then anything goes. That's literally capitalism. Profit before everything. When people complain about government regulation in business, I look at them and I laugh and I say, look, capitalism, if there is no regulation, if there are no boundaries, if there are no laws reigning in this monster, it's going to be as much as it's a force for good, it's going to be a destructive force, because the primary purpose of capitalism is profit. Every other thing is secondary. So if doing the right thing is going to come in, it's going to come in between a company and its profit, you know what? They're not going to do the right thing, because they exist first and foremost to get profits.
So there's it must feel very, very good for them to be consulted as these kind of moral
Yeah, so when
experts.
these DEI experts are, making money off this, Robin DiAngelo, Kendi, Bremex Kendi, and the rest, they are just participating in the capitalist system. And who's to blame them for that?
And so that's what they get out of it. So it's actually not very complicated. That's why they're in this, because they money, power, influence. Right? It's a tale as old as time. Now, on the other hand, you've got, so that's like the Robin DiAngelos of the world, selling the books, making millions of dollars. But then you've got the people that are actually buying the books and who are going to the race dinner and going to these seminars that we kind of crashed for our film. They're a more interesting case because they're not getting any money out of it. They're spending money, and they're not getting power, influence out of it. So for them, I think
Yeah, but
part
they
of
get
it's like
to feel good. They're getting something. They're getting some sort of emotional satisfaction from it. So they don't get to change anything about that behavior. All they just need to do is buy some books and repeat some mantras, and they're good. So still a band-aid.
virtue signal. They want to be able to tell their friends that, hey, I went to race to dinner and it was so life-changing. But then most of it for those people is that I think they actually do believe it. It is speaking to something. There's like something going on inside them. I don't know if it's just like a kind of guilt or something that they carry around. And a lot of them are secular. They don't have religion. And so this becomes kind of like a replacement for religion. I don't know if that's part of it. I think it's probably part of it.
Yeah, I feel like those people have kind of correctly identified that they were raised in a society that still does have racism as part of it.
And as I think any
their-
multicultural society always will.
Yeah,
Well,
To some extent.
it's their way of kind of trying to confront it. I think it's ill thought out, but I understand where they're coming from.
But what I would say yes, there's still racism in society. There always will be. As long as there are different races and cultures living together, you can have racism.
The funny thing about right-wingers, when they admit that there's racism in society, but when you ask them to give an example of said racism that they admit exists in society, they are unable to come up with anything. Yeah, there's still racism in society. Okay, give an example of one, and they come up blank. So why is that so? And when you point out cases of racism, examples of racism to them, they say, no, that's not racism. So where is this thing that you admit exists, but you cannot give an example of it existed?
I think we have a lot less of it than pretty much anywhere else on Earth.
Of course, you have a lot less of it than many places in the world, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You have a lot less of it than you had 100 years ago, 50 years ago, but it doesn't mean it's not a problem still. It's relative.
But whatever racism you find in society now is individual. It's not systemic. It's not in the system. These systems are not set up to disadvantage, quote unquote, people of color. In fact, the only real systemic racism you find anymore is the kind that's targeted at white people and also Asians. That's what affirmative action is. Like that, the only time you ever find a policy that specifically says, here's an advantage that you can't have if you're a race. The only time it ever says that is if it's singling out white and or Asian people.
But is that really what DEI and affirmative action does? Right. So this is very weird because he says there's no systemic racism, and then he goes and counters himself and says there is systemic racism, but it's against whites and Asians. So which is it? You can't have it both ways.
It doesn't go the other way anymore.
Well, so what about, and even people on the right now are saying Republicans have singled out Haitians, and this is an interesting segue because we were just talking about multiculturalism and how wherever you have different people from different backgrounds, races, ethnicities put together, there will always be some types of discrimination, and the goal of the culture should be to minimize that. has there been legitimate racism directed by high-profile Republican lawmakers? This is the accusation on the table towards the Haitian community in the United States, and particularly in Springfield, Ohio, in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, before he answers that, yes, there has been, especially from the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party, not other than J.D. Vance himself, who has peddled lies about Asians that they're eating pets, which Trump himself parroted during the debate with Kamala Harris. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there. This is all these without evidence. I mean, high-level Republican figures repeating these insane lies that Haitian, and they call them illegal immigrants. Why they are not illegal? Because they're actually there legally. They came in through a program, federal government program, so they're not illegal. But and I'll get there. Let's just see what Matt Walsh has to say.
No, absolutely not. I haven't heard it. Everything I've heard has been critical of the fact that we're importing, thousands of people from the third world who are coming into communities. And look, America, nobody thinks that it will benefit America to become more like Haiti. Nobody thinks that.
Of course,
I would
not.
challenge.
Of course not. Nobody thinks that. Nobody in their sane mind thinks that it will benefit America to become like Haiti. But what's your point?
Challenge anyone, if they do think that, to explain how that's the case. Like, in what way could this country be improved by making it more like Haiti? When you look at Haiti, what part of Haiti are you saying to yourself, we need more of that?
Beaches.
Well, we have more beaches than them too, right? Don't we?
Right.
We're a much bigger
right.
country.
We don't want a marine invasion and occupation of.
Now, I think
United
this is
States.
where things get interesting, because Ryan Grimes has been very cool, he's very calm, and he's been coming in with his points subtly. But, just look at what he said, right? Mouthwash is saying that you do not want a Haiti kind of situation in America, right? And Grimes is saying, yeah, we don't want that. We actually don't want anybody to invade America and turn it into the hellhole that Haiti is. Now, all this is going to be lost on Mouthwash because he doesn't understand anything. He doesn't know history. He doesn't know anything that happens outside his right-wing bubble. So he's going to get absolutely wrecked in going forward in this conversation.
It's that constantly decapitates governments and takes the money out of the country and saddles us with
We don't want the Clintons
debt from
either.
a revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, if something like that happens to the US, it's going to be a shitty place too. If you have a place where they are being invaded, where their government is unstable, where foreign powers are taking the wealth out of the country, it's going to be not a good place. But for Matt Walsh, he thinks that the reason why Haiti is the way Haiti is because of Haitians, not because of the things that have been done to them, that still continues to be done to them up until this moment.
Right. Although I don't. So you're saying that
we wouldn't want to be like basically a colony that the entire West spends 200 years punishing after the Haitian Revolution.
Exactly.
I get that.
Remember that Haiti was the first, was the first country, slave nation to gain its independence from, from the slave masters, right? And then the French imposed, in fact, they took so much wealth from Haiti. They were taking so much out of Haiti that it wasn't even possible for that country to develop. But all this is lost on Mouthwash. Mouthwash just thinks that it's Haitians, they are the ones causing the problem. It's just them. It's not what's been done to them.
I understand that, but also at a certain
We
point,
wouldn't want that. No, yes.
we wouldn't want that. But I would also say that that's not entirely why Haiti's in the position that it's in. I mean, at a certain point.
But nobody says it's entirely why Haiti is in the position it's in.
Right.
And this is the point that right-wingers like. This is a trick they like to play. If you say something, this is a contributing factor, they just take it to the extreme and say, are you saying this is the only thing responsible for? Well, nobody's saying it's the only thing responsible for it. It's a major contributing factor, doesn't mean it's the only thing. But when they paint it as such, it makes your position seem unreasonable and untenable to say, oh, this is the only thing. Oh, racism is the only thing holding black people. Of course, racism is not the only thing holding black people. But is it a problem? Is it part of the reasons? Yes, it is. But they are not ready to admit that part. But they are ready to take it to the extreme and say, they're ready to make it, hyperbolic so that they can dismiss your point and say, oh, you're just being unreasonable. How can you say this is the only thing causing the problem?
As a country, you have to stand on your own 2 feet and take care of yourself. And
but at what point is that? They elect Aristide and we overthrow Aristide. Then they elect Jovenel Moïse. Jovenel Moïse is assassinated a bunch of people with American connections, and then we install in 2021, like the United States installed the prime minister that we just ousted. Like, so we could say, okay, yeah, you got to get over the 200 years ago, but like we're still doing it.
yeah, I mean, and I'm not in favor of. I'm very non-interventionist in my
It doesn't
policies.
matter whether you're interventionist or not. The US is interventionist. You might not be interventionist personally, but the system is interventionist. That's just the way it is. You might not be in favor of interfering with other countries, internal politics or affairs, but the US does that, has been doing that for most of its history. They have been removing leaders, installing leaders. They have been sponsoring coups and doing all such manner of things. So while many Americans personally do not support that thing, but the system, the government does. Herein lies the difference, Matt Walsh.
So I'm not in favor of most of the things that we're doing in other countries.
We just made
you were
the
not in favor of it, but you implied that those were not the things that are responsible for why Haiti is what it is today. It's just because Haitians, and bringing in Haitians is going to recreate such conditions.
Government in Haiti, in a hotel room in Jamaica, and then we insisted that whatever government we made in
If you
Jamaica.
even look at the pattern of migration, immigration to the US, right? When migrants come to the US, even those that come from third world countries, don't they on average do better? I mean, their countries are shit, but when they come to the US, because there is a system that encourages development, there is a system that works, they are able to thrive. They don't sink to the bottom like the countries that they're coming from. Why? You've got to ask yourself, why is that so? I was reading something the other day that was saying that more than half of the PhD candidates or people who hold PhDs in the US are either immigrants or first generation immigrants. These are people that are coming from countries that are not well off, but they are doing well in America because there's a system that works there. They're not doing well in their countries because the countries is fucked up, right? A combination of bad management policies by the politicians, yes, and the people by themselves, and also interventionist policies from the West at times. All these things come together to create an environment where people cannot thrive, even in the face of abundant natural resources. So when you look at a place like Haiti, which had its independence a very long time ago, and there was still brutal, suppression from European powers, even up until this time. I mean, from the French and then to the Americans, up until this moment, how exactly are they supposed to thrive?
Jamaica had to allow Kenyan troops to come in under the flag of the UN in order to go to war with the gangs.
Yeah, I'm not interested in. Right. If it were up to me, I'm not interested in doing anything in Haiti.
Matt, it's not up to you. And this thing has been happening way long before you were born. So it's not up to you.
Haiti be Haiti and take care of them. That's sort of my whole point here. Let them take care of themselves and their own problems. I'm also not saying that there's like never a scenario where we would let someone from Haiti into the country. But
what scenario? What's the scenario that you let someone from Haiti come in?
It doesn't have to just be about Haiti, but when you're throwing open the gates and just inviting anyone, in particular,
I guess your assumption there was that it is Haitian people that are creating the conditions on Haiti, and that if the Haitian people come to Springfield, they will recreate the conditions.
Well, but I don't think you
Haiti in Springfield. Whereas what I'm saying is that it's actually the U.S. that has.
I don't think you can entirely put it on
largely.
Well, he did say entirely. You see what he's doing is putting words in Grimes' mouth to say that it's the U.S. It's as if Grimes is claiming that it's the U.S. that's entirely responsible for the situation in Haiti. But he didn't say that.
But it's still a country comprised of people, right?
But without
people who have not been, they have not been allowed to determine their own future or their course They have not been able to allowed to set their politics or their foreign policy or pick their leaders or manage their resources without being exploited. Okay.
Economy as
Okay, but you can't. I don't think you can entirely put it on the United States. Like
He keeps using the word entirely. No one is saying it's entirely on the US.
Haitian people have nothing to do whatsoever with the state of their own country. Nothing. I mean, I think that's a bit absurd. I'm perfectly willing to, as I said, agree that a lot of the United States sort of adventurism and interventions in other countries has been unwise, and I'd prefer for us to focus on our own country and not try to build.
It's not unwise. It's been devastating to those countries. Putting it mildly as, oh, it's been unwise, it just makes it seem as if it's nothing. It's been devastating. And this is how he's minimizing the impact of US imperialism in other parts of the world, right? It's just unwise. And he's not even seeing it from the perspective of the other countries that the US has messed up. He's seeing it from the perspective of the US to say, oh, it's unwise on our part to do this. But it being unwise is not the problem. It being devastating for them, that's the problem. But he's unable to think beyond his selfish self. He's unable to think beyond himself.
Governments in other countries. But at the same time, I think that you can't completely absolve the people of any country of the problem, just like in this country. The problems that we have in our country, we can point to the government, we can point to immigration, we point to all those things. But ultimately, like, the people of the country have to be responsible for their own nation.
Now, speaking of the Haitians themselves, right? They are called illegal immigrants. While they are not illegal, they are legal migrants, right? I think I read somewhere that the U.S. government there was a federal government program to bring in people from Haiti, and they are pushing them to some towns that are dying, like the Springfield, Ohio, was an industrial town that's dying because the population is dwindling. They don't have a workforce. Now, with the arrival of these Asians, many of the companies are reopening because they now have people coming in that are able to work. The economy is booming in these places. House prices are going up because there's a demand for it, which is also good for the business, right? And then, funny enough, these Asians are Christians, and they are reinvigorating the churches in these places. Churches that were closed, that nobody used to go to, now these churches are opening up again. To tell you that this isn't just about immigration, this isn't just about Christianity, this is somewhat about race. Right wingers will tell you that they are for legal migration. They are against illegal immigration, right? But the Haitians are legal immigrants. Yet somehow they still get accused of doing these terrible things. They're still not accepted by the right-wing circles. These right-wingers will tell you that, oh, Christianity is a good religion. In fact, they want to make Christianity the religion of the US. These Asian migrants are Christians, yet they're still not accepted, yet they're still not welcome. So you've got to ask yourself, if two things that right-wingers care so much about, these people have those two things, then why are they still not accepted? What other factors might be there? What other factors might be in play that's making these people not being accepted? Well, your guess is as good as mine.
Say that of all nations.
Right, fair enough. So you said earlier that we have less racism here than lots of other countries, which I think is a fair point to make.
Glass half full.
And obviously, you would
how
acknowledge
how exactly did you come about that? That US makes a lot of bold claims, right? Like this bold claim that it might be true, but how exactly do you know you have less racism in the US than other parts of the world? I mean, there are people that will tell you that the people who come from Europe or from Africa will tell you that white people will tell you that they never knew that they were white until they got to America, where race is essentialized. Black people from Africa would say they never knew they were black until they got to America, where everything is, categorized based on race. I'm even sure that some Black Americans who go to Europe, they are just treated as Americans. They are not treated like Black people. They're treated as Americans, even more as Americans than they are treated in their own country. So I think it's a bold claim, which might be true, but I think it's all unsubstantiated at this point to just claim that, oh, there's less racism in the US than in many other parts of the world. It might not be true.
That at some point in our history, we had lots of racism, right?
Sure.
Lots of racism then, less racism now.
Mhm.
So when did we get to a point where it wasn't systemic and it was no longer a problem that we as a democratic society need to deal with? Like, what was the moment in your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that you could point to one exact moment in time when it goes from a systemic issue to not systemic anymore. But what we know for sure is that right now we are certainly in the moment where it's not systemic. Any time in history, I'll answer your question.
Yeah.
At any point in history, when you can go back and look at actual laws and policies that were in place that deprived Black Americans or any other group of rights, well, that was a time when you had systemic, and we know that existed historically.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to point to an exact moment, I mean, I guess the most obvious moment would be the Civil Rights Act. But of course, these are changes that happen gradually over time. Just like with slavery, you can't, even with slavery, you can't really, people like to point to the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment when slavery was ended. Of course, we know that wasn't when it ended. So we know we don't have slavery anymore. But if you were to ask me, what's the exact moment when slavery stopped? Well, it wasn't an exact moment. It was a gradual ending of that horrific institution. But certainly now it doesn't exist anymore in this country anyway. And I'd say the same thing with systemic racism as well, that nobody is creating policies, again, that are deliberately intended to create disadvantages for quote unquote people of color.
I have a question
But
about
that's
that.
how systemic things work. There are no policies. Let's use something that that right wingers love to complain about. Let's say something like the quote unquote the deep state and all their 1,000 conspiracy theories that they like to put out there. Are there laws supporting the deep state? Are there laws supporting these conspiracy theories that COVID was a means of trying to control people? It was an experiment on mind control and so many of the other terrible shit that they came up with? Are there laws pushing these things? The answer is no, but you believe they exist. How does the deep state exist? How does the deep state that wants to destroy Trump, how does it exist when there are no laws specifically? There are no laws specifically pushing this thing, but you believe they exist and you believe they're systemic, even though you don't use the term systemic. When Trump says he was going to drain the swamp, what is the swamp? Are there laws that authorizes a corrupt swamp to be in the US government? No, but you believe they exist. Isn't that systemic? So you don't get to pick and choose what exists because it suits your narrative and what doesn't exist because it doesn't suit your narrative.
A lot of conservatives will say there is one policy, and this is, you're about as anti-abortion and pro-life as it gets. A lot of conservatives will say a remaining institution of systemic racism is abortion because it disproportionately, as conservatives make this argument, affects Black children and Black families. Is that an example of systemic racism or racism, period?
And I think it's a mistake when conservatives make that point, because I think conservatives are very desperate to be able to do the whole thing where they turn back on Democrats and say the Dems are the real racists.
Yes.
And I just think that's a lame move, and you're trying to use the left's own language against it, which I think it doesn't work because you're accepting sort of their premise. So what I'd say about abortion is, no, it's not systemically racist. It does disproportionately impact the Black community, no question about it. But does it exist for that? Really, is Planned Parenthood, is that why they exist right now? Because they want to kill Black babies? No. Planned Parenthood exists.
Okay, so this is the first point that he's saying that is making sense, which I agree with.
Because they want to kill babies, and they don't care what color the baby is. They just want the money that comes from it. But it just so happens that ends up disproportionately impacting the Black community. And this goes to the disproportionate impact thing, which I'm glad you brought that up, because that's usually what's used to support the theory of systemic racism is they say,
the
well,
thing about disproportionate impact, there are a lot of co-founding factors that come into play on why certain people are disproportionately affected by certain policies than others, even though the policies are not specifically discriminatory or racist in themselves, right? So there was an example that I've forgotten this guy, John Stewart gave, which I like to cite a lot, right? Why was it that many people of color were not able to break into the entertainment industry before, right? The reason why they were not able to was because the entertainment industry usually hires from interns, right? But these internship positions are unpaid. So if you want to work in that industry, you have to at least have some intern experience. And while you're having that intern experience, you're not going to be paid. Now, who are those people who would be able to afford to take an unpaid internship position? Those who come from wealth and privilege. And who are those who typically come from wealth and privilege? You're going to guess it, white people, right? So while the industry was not specifically discriminating against anybody, but it was only those who had access to resources that would be able to take unpaid internships that later on got the opportunity to finally make a career for themselves in that industry. But then you might ask yourself, how did they come about? How did that wealth disparity in the first place come about? This is where the past affects the present. A friend of mine on Twitter gave a very solid example of how it is possible for two people where there are no racist laws, where their outcomes can be totally different. So imagine America 100 years ago, a white immigrant from Europe, from Norway, and a black immigrant, say from Africa, right? The white immigrant comes into the US. They do not face the discriminatory laws that black people get to face. They have access to loans, right? Their loans are not rejected, right? So they have access to loans to build wealth, right? Over time, they are able to get to a solid base. They're able to get to a situation where they're comfortable enough even for their kid to take an unpaid internship. Compare that with, say, the black family who have not been able to build that wealth, where their kid coming out of school, you need to find an employment. So even if you want to work in this industry that you have to take an unpaid internship, you can't do that, and then you can't even go into that career. So these things are linked. These things, they have impact. So even if you don't have racist or systemic laws today, the past always affects the present. And if there are policies that are put in place to address what has happened in the past, people kick against it. DEI, affirmative action, were they implemented the best way they could be implemented? No, I don't think they were implemented the best way they could, but they were not born out of a desire to just, discriminate against white people. They were trying to address some historical wrong. They were trying to address something, but you just look at all those things and you say, oh, you want history to start today. You want everything to start today. While some people have some leg up, and then you're asking the other person that who's not able to catch up, why are you not able to catch up? You totally ignore history, you ignore the background, but you just want everything to start today. It doesn't work like that.
But these policies disproportionately impact certain groups. Again, they might, but that doesn't mean that they're intended to do that. Just a disproportionate number of Black Americans end up in prison. Does that mean that that's why the prison is there?
Well, you've got to ask yourself, why is that the case? If there's a strong correlation between crime and poverty, and there's a strong correlation between poverty in the African American community and their history, so you can see how the past affects the present, right? So if there is a disproportionate amount of African Americans in jail, and that is a carryover from their history, is a carryover from what the country did to them, then can you just entirely say that, oh, just because these people are criminals, that's why they're acting this way? No. You've got to do a deeper analysis. You've got to do a root cause analysis, and you've got to say, how do we fix this problem? What are the sort of interventions that we need to do to fix this problem? Some people will say, oh, there are policies that have been implemented for 60 years, it's not worked. Well, what makes you think those policies were implemented correctly? I mean, right-wingers get to make this point all the time that the government doesn't know how to do anything. So it might not be that the policies themselves are wrong. It might just be implementation. It might just be that the bureaucracy of the government is just messing things up. So instead of just throwing the baby with the bathwater, why don't you ask yourself, how can we make this policy work? Instead of saying it doesn't work, just throw it away.
To put Black Americans in it? No. The reason why a disproportionate number of Black Americans end up in prison is that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of Black Americans commit violent crime. That's just what the stats show. And
right. So there's an argument that a system is what it does, and that claiming otherwise is just kind of hocus pocus, just magic. Like if a system produces a certain result, but you as an observer of that system say, well, actually, that's not what the system is supposed to do. Those words are just meaningless.
What about
and
a system?
The system
This guy is just speaking so much germs, but it's going to totally fly over some people's head because they're not smart enough to understand what he's saying. But yeah, he's saying that it's usually the products of the system that is much more substantive than what it's intended to do. You might have a good policy, you might intend to do something great with it, but if the outcome is shit, it's shit, irrespective of your intention.
Chews them up and spits them out and produces and continues to produce the result that it produces. Like, for instance, during Jim Crow, pre-Civil Rights Act, you've got laws on the books that are systemically racist, that allow for straight up racist results. And when it comes
design
to
of the system was explicitly racist.
Design of the system is aimed at producing segregated schools and low-income households. Low-income neighborhoods that are predominantly or almost exclusively populated by Black Americans, right?
Mm-hmm.
You then pass laws that reform those laws, that make it so that you can't legally do those things anymore. Yet the power structure broadly remains in place and the results stay the same. You still have, broadly speaking, massive low-income areas, predominantly populated by Black families, and you continue to have segregated schools. And so a person who was born into this country today, if they're Black, they're more likely to grow up in one of those neighborhoods. They're more likely to go to terrible schools rather than good schools. They're more likely to end up in prison or in part of the system. And so you would step back and say, well, the system is still doing what it is. The system never stopped doing it. There was never a day from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday that all of a sudden the system stopped working in the same racist way, which we acknowledge was racist when it was written into the law.
Although the system
but
produces...
now we pretend it's not because we struck through that one line.
Yeah, but if we agree that you say the system is what it does, I'd probably disagree with you on that. What the system is intended to do is what it certainly matters here.
But why?
But also,
why would it matter?
Yeah, exactly.
Why
would the intention matter more than the result?
Intend a system to do? Like if
the system produces a robust Nigerian.
If you buy a car and the intention of the car is to take you from your home to your workplace, and it doesn't do that, do you say, well, because it was intended to do this, so it doesn't do it, then it's fine, it's okay? No, you're not going to accept that. But why are you accepting intention?
Middle class, like people who come here from Nigeria. Tom Sowell makes this point. It's a point that's popular.
So then that's a defense of the system.
That's what I'm saying.
Because that's what it does.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So does that go both ways?
No, because the intent of this, my point is that the intent, whatever you intend a system to do is meaningless. Like if you intend for a house to have a roof and a second floor that is sturdy, but when you walk into the second floor, you fall through it.
But that doesn't reflect
on you.
But that doesn't reflect on your anti-roof sentiments.
Yeah, and also
it doesn't matter.
And also, but to use your analogy, if you walk into a house and there's a problem in the house, you can't automatically assume that it's the fault of whoever built the house. It could be, depending on the problem. But you also have to look at who's living in the house, who's supposed to be maintaining the house. And if you're living in a house and you're not taking care of it, and in fact you're mistreating the house and it goes to hell, and then you turn around and blame whoever built the house 100 years ago. Well, I'm going to say, like, well, this is at some point you got to take responsibility for your own house. And so that's my point with the Black community as it stands right now in America. Yes, as we've already established.
If you have a house where the roof is not, the foundation is not strong, right, and it caves in on you, yeah, let's say, for example, that the occupants of the house, they're not taking good care of the house. But if the foundation or if the roof is not good, it's not good. And it's only going to exacerbate the problem. So in that case, you have joint responsibility. But what is much more impactful, the roof falling down or the people not taking care of the house in terms of the surroundings and the environment? I think the roof falling down and potentially killing people is much more impactful.
There was actual systemic racism against the Black community for a long time. It's a terrible, evil thing. Everybody agrees on that point. I don't think anyone disagrees. That is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive Black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive Black Americans of rights?
And I think this aligns with the point I was making earlier about systems existing in contravention of the laws, as in discriminatory systems. They don't exist today, right now, they don't exist by force of law. They actually exist in opposition to it, but in a much more subtle way. And I think Grimes is going to give an example, a very good example of this happening.
The same people that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the 40, throughout American history, like continued to be in control.
Yeah, but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by? I mean, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
Well, but I don't think you can bring class into this, because I mean, I would agree that we could talk about class. I'll agree that there are elites who care about themselves and don't care about the lower class. I would say that those people are just as unconcerned with a white person in a trailer park in Appalachia as they are unconcerned with a Black person in the inner city.
So why is it valid to talk about class and not valid to talk about race? If discrimination can happen class-wise, why can it not happen race-wise? I mean, both are categories. Class is a category. Race, even though it's a social construct, is also a category. So why is it okay? Why is it true that discrimination can happen along class lines, which is a category of itself, but he finds it unconscionable that it can happen along racial lines? And these things are often, interwoven.
Because so it is class. We could talk about that, but my question was, because we talk about the systems.
And also, the funny thing is that when right-wingers talk about this class issue, they're actually agreeing with Marx that they hate so much. I mean, Marx was talking about class warfare, discrimination, or talking about how the haves and the have-nots. That's exactly what Matt Walsh is just endorsing, that he believes that there's a class differential. There are certain people of certain classes who don't even care about poor Black people or poor white people. That was what Marx was talking about, and he agrees, but only so far as to make a point against race. If you remove race from the equation, then he goes against that class narrative as well.
It's a broad concept here. So let's narrow it down. Let's find a piece of the system that we can point to and say, well, this is designed to hurt Black people.
Okay, so if you go to Georgia, for instance, after they implemented school desegregation, what they started doing is saying, oh, okay, well, we can't legally keep Black people out of our neighborhoods or out of our schools, But what we can do is we can secede from our neighborhoods. I mean, you've been to the Atlanta suburbs?
A little bit.
Like every four,
Unfortunately.
like every four,
Try to stay away.
Yeah.
like every 4 blocks for a long time, you had like new school districts, and they would be drawn. They would be just basically gerrymandered. Like they would know where the white people were, and they would gerrymander the school district so that only white people would be at part of.
Yeah,
this
but you're going back to desegregation.
No. This is what they're.
This just shows how much more knowledgeable about this whole situation Grimes is compared to Matt Walsh. Grimes has been able to give examples of every point that he made. He gave an example, a real life example. Mouthwash is just arguing, trying to use common sense to argue against facts, against reality. Just because it sounds okay in your head doesn't mean that's how it is in reality. Right? So even though there are no racist laws, this is the situation that Grimes just described exists. So what are you going to say about that? If these people are using legal ways to carve themselves in a certain way such that predominantly white people are in a certain district, go to certain schools, there's nothing illegal about that. But what is the end result of it? And it is very easy to understand how this thing can happen if you also understand interests, that people have interests. Groups of people have interests. Countries have interests, right? The people who had created the United States, according to Ann Coulter, the WASPs, who had created the United States for the benefit of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Do you think that they would just readily let it go? You think they don't have the interest to protect that structure? And you think that they're not going to look for ingenious ways to protect that structure? They have an interest, and they're going to look for ways to protect that interest. It is very simple. You don't even have to make a moral judgment on it. You just have to make a neutral analysis to show that this is possible. It is very, very possible without trying to say whether it is right or wrong, whether it is morally justified or not. Interests exist, and people are going to try to protect their interests.
They're doing now. Like this is up to today. Like, so what they're doing is they're saying, okay, these are the new laws in place. However, we like our system of segregation and racism that we have
This might
here.
have well been a class for Matt Walsh. I'm wondering why he's not taking notes.
So how do we hire the best lawyers
Is that about class?
to show that, but it's also about race?
Well, but I'm saying, do you think primarily in the minds of the designers of the system, are they actually discriminating intentionally on a class basis, or is it
pretty race driven?
I don't think that there's any evidence that it's race driven. I
You don't think there's any evidence why he just gave the evidence? Well, you don't think. Simple. Period.
In like an example you give, it's class, it's people wanting to avoid crime-ridden, impoverished areas. Not, maybe someone doesn't want to send their kids to school in a place that's high crime. There's going to be a lot of delinquency and everything in the school system. I don't think it's because the kids are black. It's just because of that. And also, the other thing is when we talk about.
But at what
Of course,
point?
they will tell you that they're doing it because the kids are black. They're going to say something else, because being racist isn't cool in 2024. So nobody is going to come out and tell you that the reason they are doing this is because they are uncomfortable around black people. They're going to look for other reasons, which would seem legitimate, right?
When we talk about school districts or the way communities are set up, here's another point that rarely comes up. It's pretty simple. You can move, right? So you can always move. I mean, if you live in a community where you're claiming it's been set up systemically to disadvantage it.
Things, Matt is so out of touch. You can move. He's out of touch. You can move. Doesn't it take finance to move from a poor neighborhood to a better neighborhood? I mean, are all the houses in America, in all the neighborhoods, are they pretty affordable for anybody who wants to move to those neighborhoods? So if you're already impoverished, how are you able to move to a better neighborhood? Just saying you can move. Of course, legally you can move. No one is stopping you. I mean, no one can actually stop you from moving. But you have the resources in actuality to make that happen? And for some people, the answer is no.
I don't buy that, but if I did, I would say, well, you should probably move from that community. I mean, you can go somewhere else. It's not, there's no law saying you can't.
Of course not.
And if there was, I mean, if there was a law saying,
Some HOA situations will like try to block
yeah, but they're
it,
not going to
it's
say you
pretty-
can't move here if you're black.
It's also why a lot of Black community groups support voucher systems to allow, like, work with conservatives on voucher systems to allow kids to get to different schools.
So when you see stats that say like a black homeowner who's trying to get a mortgage, who has a higher credit score and higher income, gets a higher interest rate from the average bank than a white applicant. A bunch of these studies have been done where they'll put in like a black sounding name and higher credit scores, higher income, better candidates on paper other than their name, and they get a overall, there have been so many studies that have replicated this. They get a higher interest rate, which means their cost of borrowing is higher, means the mortgage is higher, which means you have to have that much more money to move into the neighborhood that you're talking about. So systemically, it doesn't say, well, if you're black, you can't live here, but systemically what it does is it makes it easier for white people to move into these wealthier neighborhoods, harder for black people to move into those neighborhoods. And that's before you even get to the wealth effect. Jim Crow, only ended recently, which means that if you look at the kind of savings rates and the inheritance rates for the average black family, it's close to nil, especially after the subprime mortgage wipeout of 2008, compared to white families, which can go to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and say, can you help
I mean,
put my
this
kids in
guy is just a star before Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh is a lightweight compared to Ryan. He's giving solid examples, logical examples, and he's just cool about it. This guy is so good, but he's just so mellow about it. Dishing out these points like it's nothing.
private school, can you pay the down payment? 20% is an awful lot for this mortgage.
Generational wealth.
Yeah.
Right.
So you combine the fact that they have to pay higher interest rates with the fact that there's lack of generational wealth. That to me is systemic. But I'm curious specifically on the interest rate question. What's going on there? And should that be a problem that we as a democratic society should address? Like, why are black loan applicants paying higher mortgage interest rates across the board? And again, that is replicated across the economy.
Okay, I'd have to look at the studies you're talking about. You say that they've been replicated time and time again. There's no issues with the studies, and there's no issues methodology.
I'm sure people could pick some of the studies apart, but it's pretty well accepted.
Yeah, I'd have to know who is accepted by exactly. But so for the sake of argument, let's say that those studies are totally legit. I would still go back to a class issue on that. And the reason is that, look, banks...
So essentially you become a Marxist? Is that what you're saying?
Let me explain. Like, banks care about the money. That's all they care about. They don't care about... I mean, these banks are not being run by people who are saying, we got to keep black people poor. I don't care about that. I don't think they care about anybody. They care about the money. And so if that's happening, they're making stereotypical assumptions, class-based assumptions that
somehow correlates with race. Remember, he's saying class-based assumptions because he's assuming that the black applicants are poorer, right? But the example that Marian gave was that on paper, the black applicants are better in terms of all the metrics. The only thing is that they have a black sounding name, but still they got a higher interest rate. So if every other thing, let's even say everything is equal, right? The white sounding names and the black sound, everything is equal. In this case, they are even better, but they still get a worse deal. What other thing is going on there apart from the race of this person? You have 3 applicants, 4 applicants, 5 applicants bringing in their loan request. In all of this, 3 of them are black people, and they have a better metric in almost anything than the white people. But they have black sounding names. But somehow they end up having a higher interest rate. What do you think is going on there? I mean, this was the same way that they used to determine that Donald Trump was he was discriminating against black people in housing projects and all that. They literally sent in people. They sent in people deceptively, like Mouthwash did with Robin DiAngelo, which he defended. Right? They sent in people, some with black names, some with white names, and they found that there was clear disparity. They found that when the black applicants came, they would tell them that there are no apartments to be rented to them. But when the white applicants came, somehow magically apartments opened up for them. So what else apart from the race of this individual are they basing their decision on? It can't be class, because as has been shown by Grimes, the black applicants have a better class score, if you want to put it that way. But he totally
I
ignores
believe
all
they
that.
would probably also make, if somehow they got they had the impression that this was, say, a white, quote unquote, white trash, as they're often called, from the trailer park. You know, if I think the banks would have the same sort of skeptical, discriminatory attitude in that case as they would to someone who they're assuming is from the inner city, let's say.
Right, but so the other word for that would be implicit bias. So let's say the banks.
We have to wrap, by the
Yeah.
way. We have a hard time.
Oh, but let's say okay. Well, we got to wrap in a second. But let's say the
wow.
banks.
Saved by the Bell again. She's trying to save Mouthwash from getting eaten, but you know, he's already been eaten down to his neck. So might as well just finish the job.
Only do care about money. That's a reasonable thing to say. So then what could explain why they would treat the two differently? It would have to be like you're saying. So but what you're saying is there might be some implicit bias toward
Class.
if they could identify some poor white guy, which goes to the point though of how it's easier for poor whites, which I was used to be one of, but it was easier for me to migrate out. My name is Ryan Graham.
I don't even think
you can't even tell that I was white trash.
Right.
I mean, you can if you know me pretty well, but but you can't tell on a resume or an application.
You see his
Exactly.
arrest record.
So
Yeah.
this point that Mouthwash just made, that if they suspect that the person is white trash, or if they suspect that the person is a black person from the ghetto, that's why they are going to use their implicit bias to screw them over. How exactly do you know from their application? You don't know from that if you don't know them personally, but you're making assumptions. This goes back to, definition of racism I gave earlier: discrimination or prejudice against the person based on their being a member of a certain or particular group. So it's not just simply because of hate. That's not just simply the definition of racism. These people are making decisions, right, against a person because of their belonging to a particular group. In this case, their race, which is literally racism. So Mouthwash, in essence, went to Ryan Green's show, Counterpoints, to find out whether he's racist, and he eventually found out that he was racist, or that he's racist.
Wearing a tie and everything. I wouldn't say. I mean,
There you go.
Could have fooled me.
Yeah.
Look, but I wouldn't even call it implicit bias. I think it's just like banks. They are biased
Don't be
against.
so dense. People have biases. If people can have stereotypes, why is it so inconceivable that people will not have implicit bias? People do have biases.
People they don't think will pay their mortgage, basically.
Right. And so why don't they think
Exactly.
a person with a black name will pay their mortgage?
Because I think in that case,
Despite a high credit score and a high
'cause
income.
if that is true, then they're making assumptions they're making class-based assumptions.
Not
Someone from the
class-based
lower-
assumptions. How can it be class-based when the black person has a higher credit score? The black person has a higher, in terms of class positioning, is higher. And he's going back to, they're making a class-based. So automatically he's assuming that all black people are poor. That's what Mouthwash is saying. That once you see black, you assume poor. So despite what they have on paper, you just have to assume that they are going to be a bad credit. They are going to be a credit risk. That's what Mouthwash is saying. He's literally proving the racism. I don't think he's even listening to what Brian Grimes is saying.
lower income person coming from a low income neighborhood, even if their current income is, the same as, that's the background. And so
sounds like those people face a systemic
We gotta
problem.
go.
Exactly.
well, class-based.
So for someone to look at your current financial situation and say, "Nah, we're not going to judge you based on that. We're going to judge you based on your background, where you're coming from, and all that." You're going to go through all these mental gymnastics to assess them. What does that tell you, Matt Walsh?
But that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we're getting told.
We're getting
we got
in the ear. Matt, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed the movie. Ryan, what'd you think?
It's funny. I'll acknowledge this. The movie's funny. These guys are
You put
clowns.
that on the poster.
Yeah. These guys are
It's
total.
going.
These
It's
guys
right
are total clowns.
Matt Walsh, thank
Yeah.
you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that wraps it. I mean, that wraps it for me. Mouthwash went into this conversation to find out whether he was racist, and my verdict is yeah. He may not admit it, but from what he said, from what he's saying, he pretty much is, right? Because you're making assumptions against a person based on them being a member of a certain race, and you're being prejudiced against them. But he keeps trying to bring it back to class and class and class. And in that sense, he's becoming a Marxist. But he's not going to admit that he's a Marxist, right? So there's been a lot of spicy comments. I was trying to not look at the comments so far. There's been some things between Stanley and John Lennon. Anyway, that's the much I can take for today. I don't know if Stanley wants to come in to have 5 minutes a 5-minute conversation. It's been a long time since I talked to anyone here. So maybe I'll just put the link in the description, and anyone who wants to come in, let's have a chat for a few more minutes before we end the stream, right? So we went through the situation of Matt Walsh's documentary, Am I a Racist? I think we started with the Laura Loomer tweet, right, where she basically made some assumptions about Kamala Harris just because she has Indian heritage, right? She made the assumption that Kamala Harris is going to be a scammer, is going to be and all this yada yada yada. Stanley, how are you doing?
What's up, old friend?
How
you
good.
doing?
Been a while.
Yeah, it
Good.
has been. No, I just really just came up to say hi and just say, yeah, you know what? Matt Walsh is a lightweight, period.
Yeah, he is.
Ryan Grimm is just the latest example of that. So
Yeah. Thanks. So we'll probably have another show some other time where we can talk more. I have to end this now, but thanks for coming on. Thanks for listening.
absolutely,
And,
I've enjoyed your rebroadcast of the loneliness of the Black Republican.
Oh yeah, I had to put that out there again. Yeah, and that was the best conversation we've had so far. I mean, it was so good. It was really, really good, and I really enjoyed it. And I hope that we'll have I'll look for another interesting topic that we can talk about sometime soon.
Yeah, anytime you want. I'm game for it.
All right, Stanley. Thank you so much for coming.
Take it easy.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Thank
See you later.
John, and
Bye.
every other person for coming. And I'll catch you guys in another live stream. So it's going to be bye for now.